Hey everyone. Before the video begins, I just wanted to make you aware of a GoFundMe, linked down below, for some dear friends of mine who are one of many lives completely upended by Hurricane Helene. These friends had their home flooded last year during Hurricane Idalia and were displaced for nearly a year while they wrangled with insurance, FEMA, and contractors to just now, a year later, get their lives back to normal, only to a few weeks after have their entire home destroyed again by 5 feet of flooding within the space of 12 hours. Now, with all that being said, don't feel obligated to donate. I'm just hoping that we as a community can give them enough leeway financially as they go through the recovery process and decide how to approach this incredibly uncertain time in their lives. Thank you. On Halloween night, back in 1978, I was just 10 years old and I was getting ready to go trick-or-treating with my buddies from 5th grade. I remember being really excited because the year before, my friends and I had gotten to run up and down the streets in total freedom, knocking on houses wherever we could. Now, it sounds crazy to think that we were allowed to go out at night at that age, almost totally unsupervised, but since we were going from door to door and being constantly greeted by adults giving us candy, I guess folks figured that it was just safe as could be. And it really was. We had the night to ourselves, running around like crazy and seeing all our elementary school friends in their costumes. Then, at one point, there was this big old candy swap going on, where kids would swap their pixie sticks for Dum-Dums and their Tootsie Rolls for peanut butter cups, like some big old candy stock exchange. It was magical. One of those childhood memories you carry with you for the rest of your life, and most importantly, nothing very untoward happened. And so, as you can imagine, I was incredibly excited to do the whole thing again next year, and then incredibly disappointed when I found out it wasn't happening. The first year, so back in 77, I remember my parents saying something like, "Just make sure you're back before dark and don't go too far." But then the next year, in 78, my mom seemed way over-involved right from the get-go. She wanted to know who I'm going out with, where they live, what their parents' names were, and if I know their phone numbers and all of that. She asked me a million questions to the point where it got very annoying, and then when I told her that I was heading out to meet my friends, she broke some very bad news. I wouldn't be leaving on my own, and I wouldn't be trick-or-treating with my 5th grade buddies. I'd be waiting for our neighbor, Mrs. Anderson, to stop by with a bunch of random neighborhood kids, and she was going to walk us up and down the block for like half an hour before dropping us off back home. And believe me when I say, I was devastated. I kept asking why, what had changed, and why I couldn't go out with my friends. But all my mom would tell me was that if I didn't want to go with Mrs. Anderson, then I wasn't going trick-or-treating at all. I don't know if every kid's mom waited until the last goddamn moment to ruin their Halloween, but mine did, and I was on the verge of full-blown tears before I finally gave in. I was either going to suck it up or miss out on the big bag of candy and time with my friends, so obviously I chose the candy. I remember finishing off my cowboy costume in a real stinker of a mood, then when Mrs. Anderson showed up to collect me, off I went. It was me, Mrs. Anderson, and 3 other random kids from the neighborhood, one of which was Mrs. Anderson's kid, Billy. And at first I was still in a very terrible mood because I wasn't with my friends. We were under strict supervision, and Mrs. Anderson said that we could only walk in a short loop up and down the street. All the other kids were in chaperone groups like that too, so it wasn't like it was just us, and although it wasn't as lame as I thought it was going to be, it still sucked compared to the chaos of the previous year. So, we're maybe 20 minutes into the adult-mandated trick-or-treating, and the adults have this thing organized so badly that there's congestion toward the end of the route. We're literally queuing at this one house in front of not one, but 2 other groups of trick-or-treaters, and as Mrs. Anderson and the lady in front start talking to each other, her son sort of sidles up to me, points off into the distance and says, "That kid's giving me the creeps." I look to see what he's pointing at, and off in the distance, there's a kid standing near the edge of the park where the old jungle gym was. He was close enough for us to see that he was wearing a mask, but he's not with any kind of group. And so we say, "Hey, what gives? That kid gets to walk around on his own, why not us?" Looking back on it, it was kind of cold of us to just drop him like that, but we were kids. We didn't know any better. We saw perceived injustice and we called it out. Even chimps and monkeys go crazy when they think something is unfair. Anyway, we start yelling about this kid out there alone, and Mrs. Anderson sees him too, so she starts saying something like, "Hey, come back here right this instant, young man. You have to stay with your group." The kid just kind of stands there for a minute, not responding, and then Mrs. Anderson yells at him again, and he starts walking over to the groups of kids. Mrs. Anderson then says, "Which group are you with?" And then starts asking all around to the adults something like, "Was this kid with you?" But none of the adults seemed to recognize his mask, so each just sort of shook their heads when confused in the chaos. I remember looking at the kid and thinking how I was 99% sure that I hadn't seen him around that night. I'd been checking out everyone else's costumes and whatnot, and I didn't remember this kid's green goblin mask anywhere. Also, it wasn't a green goblin mask like the villain from Spider-Man. It was just sort of a goblin that happened to be green. Maybe that inspired Spider-Man, I don't know. Now anyways, I'm looking at the kid's mask thinking, I don't remember seeing him around. But at the same time, something about him was just oddly familiar to me. I don't know if it was his shoes or his clothes or the way he carried himself, but I'm pretty sure that I knew that kid from school. It turns out that I was 100% right on that one, but we'll get back to that later. So Mrs. Anderson is calling around towards all the other grown-ups asking if they're missing a kid, but I'm still watching the kid and trying to figure out why he seems so familiar. So Anderson isn't watching him, but I am. And that meant that I was still watching him when he slips away from Mrs. Anderson, walks right up to a kid in the group behind us that had just joined the line, and then pulls out a knife out of that candy bag that he had with him and just starts stabbing. Things were calm one minute and chaos the next, and all I remember is running back to my house because I was only a block away. My dad came to the door, and as I ran inside, he ran outside because he could hear 50 kids all screaming and running with adults trying to corral them. I mean, it must look like a freaking disaster movie or something, because some kids got blood on them, some of the adults had blood on them too. Just wild stuff for him to run out into with no context whatsoever. And I spent the rest of the night in my bedroom, scared out of my mind with my mom making sure that I wasn't freaking out too hard, and the rest of this I got from my dad, so it's kind of secondhand info. I obviously saw the first stabbing happen up close, and in my head, I was thinking way more kids got hurt, maybe got killed too. But by some sheer miracle, no one died, and only one kid and one grown-up had to be taken to the hospital. And the grown-up only got hurt because they cut their hand on the knife while grabbing it off of the kid in the goblin mask who was doing the stabbing. It seems like we kind of dodged a bullet, right? That it could have been way worse? Well, it was way worse. And even now, no one really knows any of what that kid says is true or not. It's became an enduring urban legend in the town that I grew up in, though. And so the way it happened was that the kid started stabbing, and then some grown-up with brass balls ran up and immediately subdued the kid before he could hurt anyone else. The kid who got hurt received only defensive wounds, as in cuts to their hand, wrists from trying to defend themselves, you know. But then, the cuts were only minor, and it was like the kid was only trying to scare her, not really hurt her, but it just got out of control. That kind of fell in line with the kid's story, but like with that other thing about recognizing him, I'll get to that later. And so, this courageous grown-up pins the kid down, grabs the knife off of him, cutting themselves in the process, and like some Christopher Nolan version of Scooby-Doo, they pull the mask off the kid to reveal who the mysterious villain truly is, only to discover that it was a kid named Leroy. Leroy wasn't this kid's real name, obviously, but I don't think it's my place to be spreading him or his family name around the internet over something he did when he was 12 or however old he was. But he sure as hell looked like a Leroy, so I guess that's what I'll call him. Anyway, this Leroy kid came from a very bad family. Mom was on drugs, didn't take care of him properly, and Dad was never around. It's a real sad story and not Leroy's fault at all, but he ended up with a reputation as being like the school stinky kid. But then, almost totally unbeknownst to us kids, Leroy's appearance at the trick-or-treating event surprised everyone, and not just because he pulled out a knife, but because by that point, Leroy had been an official missing person for almost 2 months. So at the start of the school year, Leroy didn't show up to school. The school's principal then reached out to the county sheriff, who drove out to Leroy's family trailer to talk to his mom or her boyfriend. And both were high out of their minds, thought Leroy was at school, and raised all hell when the sheriff and his boys took them away in cuffs for child neglect. They had no idea Leroy was missing, but word has it that his mom bawled her eyes out down at the department, and I guess whenever she sobered up, it hit her what a terrible mom she was, and at first, everyone blamed her and her no-good boyfriend for Leroy's disappearance. By the end of September, the sheriff had to scale back the search for him. The weather was getting colder, the nights were getting darker, and it was looking more and more like it was a search for Leroy's body rather than a search to find him alive. And that was doubly so by the time Halloween rolled around, because how the hell was a 12-year-old kid going to survive being homeless for the better part of 2 months? Everyone was real shocked to hear how Leroy had just showed up out of nowhere. But what shocked them even more was the story he told the cops when they finally got around to interviewing him. Because when they asked him why he'd showed up with a knife and tried to stab somebody, he told them, "The devil made me do it." And I'm guessing the cops figured that it was just an excuse at first. You know, kind of like that I Don't Like Mondays killer girl, that it was blatantly just an attempt to disguise her total psychopathy. But when they asked more questions on who this devil was and how he met him, it became increasingly obvious that Leroy had been kidnapped and held by not one, but several different people. According to Leroy, he was playing outside one day when a man approached him claiming to be a friend of his father's. The guy asked if he wanted to meet him, and of course Leroy says yes, but he also said how he wasn't comfortable just wandering off with a stranger. The guy says, "No problem, let me go get your dad," and then returns a half hour later driving a van and telling Leroy that his dad is in the back. And little Leroy then approaches the back of the van, looks inside, and then before he even realizes it's empty, the guy shoved him into the back, closed and locked the door, and then drove off with him, screaming to be let out. Leroy said the guy drove him somewhere, someplace he'd never seen before, and had no idea how to get back to. He said he was forced into a windowless room, with nothing but a mattress and a bucket, and then kept there for so long and tortured so horribly that he lost track of time. He said he got so thirsty and hungry that it hurt, but when he begged for water, the man who took him gave him water that tasted bad, and after that he felt weird, like he was tired but different, and had dark spots in his memory. The cops asked why Leroy had told them that the devil made him do it, and he replied that although he didn't know if the man was the devil for sure, that's what he called himself. He said the only time they really talked was when the devil took him out of the room one day to meet his helpers. Leroy said that he drank some of the bad-tasting water a while before, but was still feeling woozy when the devil took him out of his room and over towards a circular dining table. Sat around it were 5 or 6 men in cloth hoods, but the man who called himself the devil was wearing a larger wooden mask that had carved horns sprouting from the top. The man calling himself the devil then introduced the men as his helpers, and told Leroy that he was to obey them just like he obeyed him. And that's when Leroy said that they gave him the mask, and told him what they'd given him was very important. They made him wear it, never letting him take it off all the way, not even when he ate and drank. Then, after what we know was almost 2 months in captivity, the man calling himself the devil told Leroy that the only way to get the mask off was to make a human sacrifice. Leroy said that by that time, he was ready to do just about anything for a shot at freedom, so he did exactly as the devil and his helpers asked him and attacked the trick-or-treating groups that I was a part of. He said one of Satan's helpers then walked him across the park to where our groups were trick-or-treating, gave him the bag with the knife in it, and then told him to do as he'd been told. Leroy said that the moment he killed a kid, any kid, the devil would then transport him back in time to his mom's trailer, and that it'd be like he'd never been taken at all. And that was all it took to get him close enough for us to see him, and when Mrs. Anderson called him over, I guess he saw his chance right there. I don't know exactly what happened to old Leroy after that, as in I don't know exactly where he is now or exactly how the legal process went after he was taken into custody. But I do know his mom and her boyfriend got into trouble for child endangerment and all of that, and then Leroy himself got taken to some kind of psych hospital/kiddie prison, I guess. The doctors there said there was a whole bunch of things wrong with him, but he wasn't insane or delusional, and some of the marks on his body were consistent with the methods of torture that he described to the cops. But the thing that really messed with people, and had this taking on urban legend status even after all these years, is the fact that the cops never recovered the mask. You see, after Leroy was taken down and the cops showed up, someone had already taken the mask off of him, I guess. I said a Scooby-Doo moment earlier, but it wasn't really like that. They always used to wait until everything was over and done with before taking off the bad guy's mask, right? Well, this was real life, so almost the second that they had Leroy pinned down, someone whips that thing off of him right there, and then to see who it is, because why wouldn't you? But then by the time the cops got a crime scene set up and went looking for Leroy's green goblin mask that he was supposedly wearing, no one could find that anywhere. The cops started asking folks in the neighborhood to make sure that there isn't a kid who had picked up the mask by accident. But then when no one comes forward, they start going door to door in the neighborhood to make damn sure that there hasn't been a mistake. After all, Leroy said all his captors touched the mask at some point, sometimes with their bare hands, so the cops wanted to maybe check it for fingerprints or something like that. And in fact, I think it was probably their only connection between Leroy and his supposed kidnappers. But no matter what they did, they couldn't recover the mask. And to some, it stands to reason that the person who took it did not want it to fall into the cops' hands. Which means that there's a whole bunch of people who think that, right as all the chaos was unfolding after Leroy stabbed a kid, someone who looks so normal that there's not a single witness to report them just sort of walks up, picks up the mask, and then walked off into the darkness, maybe appearing as another parent. And since no one was ever arrested or convicted of Leroy's kidnapping, those same folks who think it's all some conspiracy hiding in plain sight, they believe his kidnappers are still out there, and that maybe they've been doing stuff like that for longer than we can imagine. Now we know Leroy was kidnapped, and we know he tried to stab a kid, but as for everything else, I guess a judge might just call it hearsay. But me personally, I don't know what to believe. Because from where I'm standing, much stranger things have happened and are still happening right now. I just know that what Leroy told the cops, and the fact his mask was never found, somehow scares the living hell out of me. The single most frightening, confusing, and traumatizing thing that's ever happened to me happened on Halloween night of 1999. My mates and I had just started year 7, which in America is equivalent to 6th grade, starting at 11 and finishing at 12. Starting secondary school was exciting, but it also meant that we were quickly reaching the point where it was no longer acceptable to go trick-or-treating. I don't know what it's like in America, but around here, if a load of kids walk up your drive dressed like minions, of course you're going to give them a mini Mars bar or 7. But if a bunch of surly-looking almost teenagers, complete with pimples and mini stashes, start banging on someone's door, demanding chocolate under threat of vandalism, they'd be lucky to leave with broken teeth, let alone rotten ones. Now, with that in mind, we knew it was a case of one last blowout, then jack it in for good in hopes of transitioning to Halloween costume parties with beers and ciggies and, most importantly, girls. But before all that, we could have one more night of wholesome costume fun and ensure a sweets haul that'll last us till Christmas if we rationed it properly. And so, in March of 1999, you might remember, The Matrix came out. I don't need to explain what The Matrix is, so I won't, and nor will I have to explain why a bunch of 11-year-old boys thought it was the best thing since sliced bread. So when it came to Halloween costumes, we decided to just be The Matrix. And not one of us either, but all of us. But then, because we didn't all have the making of a Matrix costume, 2 of us just wore school uniforms, black ties, and sunglasses, at night by the way, blind as bats. And then 2 of us wore leather jackets and sunglasses, myself included, while the 5th lad, whose sister was into all that goth music, was the only one who did the full Monty. We looked stupid, like 2 members of the village people and their security guards, but then the 5th lad, Jamie, he actually looked the bee's knees now that I look back on it. He had the long leather trench coat, extra long since he borrowed it from his older sister. He had the little sunglasses, like the ones Morpheus actually wears, and he had his hair all slicked back with hair gel too, with some army boots, black jeans, and a black t-shirt on to complete the look. He actually looked fantastic, to be honest, but he also stood out like a sore thumb walking around neighborhoods where kids were dressed as Woody or Buzz from Toy Story. And so we start knocking on these houses, and we either get pensioners asking, "What the bloody hell are you lot dressed as?" or young blokes laughing when they instantly recognized what we were supposed to be. It was a really good laugh, actually, and we made our way up and down the streets near where we lived, until eventually we ran out of houses to knock at. It was only about 7:30 by that time, and none of us had to be back inside until 10 at the earliest, so we still had ages to kill and very little to do. But then, Jamie had an idea. Instead of just going home, we could walk down a road a bit and cross over the dual carriageway and then knock at some houses in the neighborhood across from us. We all agreed that was a good idea because who wouldn't want more mini chocolate bars? There was just one small problem. We'd have to pass the Homewood estate. Homewood is probably one of the roughest areas of Bradford. That's not to say that the vast majority of people who live there aren't friendly and welcoming, because 99% of the time, you can walk and drive around the area and not get even an ounce of trouble. It's just never been the safest place to be after dark, especially not for a group of 11-year-olds dressed like debt collectors on their way to a rave. But then, we had ourselves a little plan. Instead of walking down one of the larger roads past the estate, we'd walk through the alley near the train tracks, which would minimize our exposure to the estate while passing it to get to the other neighborhood. Now, sorry for the logistical briefing there, but I'm just giving you an idea of why we thought it was a good plan to go walking down an alleyway after dark while dressed like a German industrial band. We thought that we wouldn't run into any of the bad lads who lived on the estate, but little did we know, they were hanging out in the one place we didn't want to bump into them. So about halfway down the alleyway, there's a blind 90-degree turn, then you can't really see much at the end of the alley either. We thought that gave us cover, and it did, but it also meant that we couldn't see what was around either bend. We round the first one, and there's no one there, so we think brilliant, we're in the free and clear. But then we round the second corner, and we run into half a dozen of the very people we hoped not to run into. I didn't know all the lads' names, but I do remember 3 of them. The main 2 were the Hand twins. Francis and Anthony Hand were both boxers and had the reputations to match. They'd been in trouble with the police, mainly because they loved to fight, but they were partial to just about any kind of crime you can imagine. So robbing a few costume kids of their sweets was really nothing to them, especially since we were considered fair game. And by that I mean of a certain age and male, so not too shameful to rob and possibly slap around some kids like us for a bit. And so the second we round the corner, there's obviously this massive uh-oh moment for us. But the Hand twins and company just burst out laughing. They obviously knew what we were dressed as. Everyone of a certain age did because the Matrix was bloody massive at the time, but they weren't exactly the type to go giving us compliments on how much effort we put into our various costumes. Instead, they saw fit to try and humiliate us. They were laughing their heads off, shouting stuff like, "These dickheads think they're in the bloody Matrix." And we tried our best to just ignore them, which was stupid really, because when lads like that sense any kind of weakness, you're well and truly buggered. And so despite trying to just walk around them, they were in no mood to simply let us pass. It started when they noticed our bags of sweets, at which point one of the Hand twins started saying something like, "Look, boys, they brought us all their sweets." And they started trying to grab one of our lads' bags of sweets, saying something like, "You're too old to be dressing up like that, and too fat to be eating those sweets." Which, to be fair, he probably was, but just because we couldn't fight back didn't mean we were about to just let ourselves be bullied. So, one of them trying to rob our mate's bag of sweets, but our mate saying, "No, get off me, you wanker." He's not throwing punches or anything, but the confrontation was exactly what the Hand twins and company were looking for. So as soon as there's a bit of argy-bargy, the Hands and friends spread out along the street so we couldn't pass at all. We didn't all shout run or anything, but there was this very recognizable moment where we all just kind of looked at each other thinking, we're in trouble here. Then when the first one of us turned around and ran back down the alley, the rest of us followed. But so did the Hand twins, who with their boys behind them went chasing us like the clappers of hell. We ran like lads possessed, and since we were running down a blind entry, there was only one way we could all run. But then, once we rounded the corner and sprinted to the end of the alleyway, there was no plan on where we were all running to. Two of the lads ran left, probably with the intention of running backwards towards our neighborhood, but the other three of us ran right. This was definitely not a good idea, as we'd have to walk back the way we came if we wanted to get home. But in the moment, all we were thinking was run, run, run. So I just acted on instinct and ran right with my two mates. After the turn, we were faced with quite a long, straight road with a wall on one side and trees on the other. I happened to notice that to our right, where the trees were, there was a little gap in a chain-link fence, and on instinct, I just ran for it. I didn't really know what was on the other side. It all looked abandoned and overgrown, but I thought, in that case, it'd be a good place to hide. I thought my mates would follow me because, being the faster runner, I'd managed to overtake them by the time that I'd spotted the chain-link fence. I thought they'd see me spotting a hiding place and would be right on my tail, but the Hand twins and company were much closer than I first thought. If they'd have done the same as me and run for the fence, they'd have been slowed down trying to force their way through the gap, and the Hand twins gang would have caught up with them. But then, being at the front, I didn't know that. So after bursting through the fence and looking over my shoulder, my first thoughts were this weird mix of, "Oh no, I'm alone," and "Oh thank God," because it didn't look like anyone was following me. Through the metal gates of whatever abandoned plot I was on, I saw my mates running past, then what looked like all of the Hand twins' crew, so there was this wash of relief that passed over me. I didn't stop running though. I was still scared out of my wits and wanted to find a hiding place. So that's what I did, and it basically involved sitting in a bush that had a view of the front entrance so I could be hidden whilst being aware of my surroundings. If this had happened a few years later, we'd have all had mobiles to call each other on, but it was 1999, and I know people had mobiles back then, but not 5 working-class 11-year-olds from Bradford. And so instead of being able to do some information gathering, I had no choice but to sit there in my leather jacket with my bag of sweets and just wait until I thought the coast was suitably clear. I'm not sure how long I waited, but it felt like a long time. Then just as I started to think, yeah, I might be safe to run home, I saw someone walking on the other side of the metal gate toward where the gap in the fence was. Obviously, I froze in place, not being able to see who it was, just knowing someone was there, and that it might have been one of the lads chasing us. But then I remember thinking, if it was one of the lads chasing us, then why are they walking? They seemed to be walking quite calmly too, not even a brisk walk or jog to suggest that they had any urgency around them whatsoever. I started to think, it's okay, this is probably just some dog walker. Then just as I was about to climb out of the bush I'd secreted myself in, I heard something that turned my blood to ice. It was the sound of the chain-link fence rattling. Someone was forcing their way in. I couldn't see who it was straight away. There were a few trees blocking my view of that portion of the fence, but I think I knew deep down that it must have been one of that hand crew because I didn't even have to see them to know that I'd had to get back into the bush, crouch down and pray that no one found me. I then watched as a lad called Fernsey stepped out from behind the trees. I didn't know him personally, I just knew him by that nickname, Fernsey. He didn't know me either, and although we'd seen each other around town, we'd never spoken a word in exchange. He had no reason to hate me, no reason to want to kick the shite out of me and rob my sweets, but that didn't stop him from chasing me, and for some reason, that scared me even more than the prospect of getting the crap beaten out of me. But even scarier was seeing him start to actively and methodically hunt for me. I didn't think anyone had seen me dart through the chain-link fence, otherwise surely they'd have immediately chased me. But as it turns out, someone had seen me, and they were in no rush to come back. I didn't know Homewood all that well, you see, and they knew something I didn't. Fernsey didn't say anything as he stalked closer and closer to the bush I was in. He couldn't see me, but by the time he got within a few feet, he bolted it and ran as fast as I could out the back of the bush. I ran and ran, thinking there'd be some kind of way out ahead of me, but there wasn't. There was only this big brick wall at the back of whatever abandoned plot I was on, and the only chance I had of scaling it was to climb a tree that was off to my right, then hop over the wall after darting along one of its branches. And so I ran, and when I got there, I dropped my bag of sweets and started to climb, but it wasn't fast enough. I was just about to scramble up a low branch I'd managed to grab onto when I just felt this pair of hands take hold of my leg. Fernsey pulled me down so hard that I grazed my hands on the branch and was dragged out of my grip, and as I fell, I landed so awkwardly that I felt this shooting pain go through my ankle before I collapsed to the floor. I don't know if I genuinely thought that me being hurt would deter Fernsey from beating me up, or if that was just pure wishful thinking on my part, but it didn't make a blind bit of difference. I kept saying to him stuff like, "Please, no, stop, I think I broke my ankle." But it was like he wasn't listening at all. He just started kicking me, over and over again, aiming for my head, but sometimes getting my chest and shoulder, and my arm, which I was using to cover my head. He just kept kicking me, until in the end, I made one final attempt to beg him to stop, which unfortunately meant that he had a nice little window to land a full-force kick right in my face. I don't think I was knocked out, but I was definitely stunned. The pain that shot through my nose and mouth was like nothing I'd ever felt before, and all I could do was lie there, holding my face and head while groaning for him to stop. I don't think it could get any worse. I mean, I was scared that he might kill me or something, mostly by accident in one of those "it was only a prank" that turns deadly. But aside from that, I really didn't think I had much else to worry about. But then, Fernsey started trying to pull my pants down. And that's how I know I wasn't knocked out, because I felt it. And when I did, I started to scream in a way I didn't know I was capable of. I actually didn't know what he was planning at the time. I was too young and naive to think boys were in any danger of that. I just thought that he wanted to humiliate me even further by making me walk back home in the nude. And with that in mind, it was my turn to attack him. Although, to be fair, my attempt was laughably ineffective. However, what throwing punches and kicking out at him did do was ensure that I bought myself just enough time for the hand twins to show up. At first, this was terrifying to me, as it looked like Fernsey now had backup to finish whatever humiliation he was planning. But in some weird twist of fate, it was those hand twins who saved me from what was about to happen. They started laughing at Fernsey, not with him, but at him, and all because he'd got my pants halfway down, and just in case I haven't made it clear already, I'm a boy, not a girl. And they were asking him what he was planning, like sort of making fun of him, calling him gay and stuff like that, and they got him to stop immediately, but then instead of trying to strip me, he started kicking the crap out of me again. The hand twins were like, "Whoa, what are you doing?" Because they could see what the state I was already in, and they just wanted to scare us and rob us of our sweets, not bloody kill us. One of the brothers, I think his name was Francis, then started slapping Fernsey around, saying how he hated bullies, which is ironic because that's the exact thing they were doing to us, it seemed like. They didn't let me leave with my sweets, but they did let me pull my pants up and leave, which to be honest was all I really wanted to do anyway. I never told anyone what Fernsey tried to do, and if you're probably wondering why I haven't used many names, is because I still want a little bit of anonymity in all of this. As for Fernsey, I don't think that matters anymore because he's no longer with us. 7 years after that incident, Fernsey was stabbed to death on a quiet street after a car with 4 lads hit him at 50 miles an hour. People just thought it was some kind of gang beef, but the way they killed him makes me think it was something a bit more personal, and that perhaps I wasn't the only one that Fernsey had tried to do something terrible to. My name is Martin, and I've been listening to your YouTube videos since the summer, and since Halloween is coming up, I thought now would be as good a time as ever to share something personal with you. I say personal, but it didn't strictly happen to me. It happened to my dad, but as you can imagine, having something terrible happen to my dad was something I took extremely personally. I grew up in High Wycombe, a town of less than 100,000 people that sits on the northwestern edges of London. I feel like I got the best of both worlds growing up because London is only about half an hour away by train, but High Wycombe is surrounded by countryside and parks, so it's not nearly as fast-paced as life in the capital. London has quite a lot of crime, relatively speaking anyways, whereas High Wycombe is the kind of place where, if there's even so much as a burglary, the whole town is shocked. That kind of thing makes me feel lucky to have been brought up there because the violence and apathy of the big city hasn't yet permeated their way into the country. Then, back in 2018, something happened on Halloween night that made everyone think those days of innocent tranquility were over. Just like everywhere else in the UK, kids in High Wycombe are exposed to a lot of American culture via movies and TV programs. So when it comes to late October, they want to dress up, have a Halloween party, and go trick-or-treating. I say that thing about American culture because my parents were always fond of telling me that when they were kids, there was no such thing as trick-or-treating, and everyone looked forward to bonfire night instead, which is only a few days later on Remember, the 5th of November. Anyway, so come Halloween night, there are quite a few trick-or-treaters roaming the dark, rainy streets of High Wycombe, terrorizing pensioners with demands for Haribo. But I only got a brief glimpse of them because I was headed to a Halloween get-together over at a friend's house. It was a weeknight, a Wednesday if I remember correctly, so although I couldn't stay out too late, I was 17 at the time and had 6th form in the morning, I was excited to sneak a few beers in my mate's back garden. His parents were really chill like that. As long as we didn't take the piss and get too loud, then we were fine to have a few cans. I got there at about 5 after I'd arrived home from school and changed, while my mate's parents said that we'd all have to make our way home by 11. But then, after a few hours of light drinking and hanging out, my mate's mom came out into the back garden to tell me that my mom had just been on the phone. I asked if everything was okay, and my mate's mom said they had to go home right away. I asked why, and my mate's mom said that she didn't know, only that my own mother had called her, asking to make sure that I was on my way home immediately. I remember one of my mates being like, "Uh-oh, what have you gone and done now?" And the implication being that I was in trouble somehow. I was actually convinced that was the case myself, and as I walked back home, I was racking my brain trying to figure out exactly what I'd done to warrant having my evening interrupted like that. I arrived back home, just about ready to face the music, but after unlocking the door and walking inside, things didn't go anywhere near how I expected them to. Usually speaking, if I was in trouble, the first thing that I'd hear when walking through the door is, "Andrew, me and your mom would like a word with you." And that was generally the sign that I was about to get a bollocking, and it was usually my dad who delivered that stern opening address. But that night, on Halloween night back in 2018, it was my mom who had called me into the front room, and she didn't sound angry at all. She sounded terrified. It feels weird looking back on it now because at the time I just knew something had happened to my dad. He should have been home when I got back at around 10 p.m., but he wasn't, and then the fact that my mom seemed so upset over something, I just picked up on it right away. Before she could even say anything else, I walked into the front room and asked, "Where's Dad?" And she just replied, "Dad's in the hospital." Then she told me to sit down. I asked, "Is he going to die?" And my mom said, "No." But that something had happened that meant that he probably is going to be scarred for life. I was extremely relieved to hear that he wasn't going to die, and I had this weird feeling that whatever came next would be fine. And I know that sounds weird, maybe a little bit callous, but it was like, no matter what my mom said next, at least he's not dead. It might be some life-changing injury, but at least I'm not going to lose him. That kind of emotional whiplash definitely helped me put things into perspective. But what happened to my dad was absolutely atrocious, and something I find chillingly disturbing even nearly 6 years later. While I was at my mate's house, chilling in his back garden, quite literally with it being October, my mom and dad had been receiving a steady stream of trick-or-treaters. The majority of them came between about 6 and 7. Then as it got closer to 8 o'clock, the knocks on the door were getting fewer and further between. About 7:45, Mom and Dad got one last knock at the door. Mom said that she remembered telling my dad how they were almost out of sweets to hand out and how next year he should buy more. Dad gets up, walks to the door, then opens it up. But instead of seeing a group of kids in fancy dress calling out trick-or-treat, there's just one grown-up standing there with some kind of white ghost mask on. My dad takes one look at this bloke and says something like, "You're having a laugh, aren't you, mate?" And the bloke doesn't say anything in response. Instead, he started to unscrew a bottle of what my dad said looked like pink Lucozade. My dad said he sort of knew that it must have been some kind of prank, and he had a feeling the bloke was about to try and give him a Lucozade shower. So when he launched the liquid at my dad, he darted behind our door so that the liquid landed and hit him on the face and on the part of his foot that wasn't covered by a slipper. The guy with the bottle then legged it really fast away, and my dad said that he thought it was weird to not hear any kind of laughter or anything like that. And this is also in the age of smartphones, so my dad also expected to maybe see someone filming the whole thing from the street, but there was no one there. Some rando had literally walked up our drive, all alone, thrown Lucozade onto my dad, and then just ran off. But that confusion only lasted a few short seconds for my father, because just moments after that pink liquid touched his skin, it started to burn. Mom said that she just heard my dad suddenly yelping like he was in loads of pain. Then when she ran out to see what was happening, a patch of skin on the side of his face was blistering and bleeding. Neither of them had any idea what was going on until the ambulance was on their way, at which point my dad started realizing that whatever was in that lad's bottle was not Lucozade, and that it was some kind of corrosive acid. Mom said that he was shouting at her to grab some baking soda or bleach because he thought that he could neutralize the chemical reaction, but Mom was on the phone to the ambulance when that happened, and when she asked the lady on the phone if that's what she should do, the woman gave her clear instructions not to try and neutralize it, or it might make things worse. They still didn't know what kind of substance the guy had thrown onto my dad, so until they did, they were to just wait until medical professionals had arrived before they started treatment. Dad was in agony by the time they arrived, but he still had enough about him to tell my mom to wait at home so I wouldn't arrive back to an empty house and then potentially see something on the news. We were allowed to visit him the next day before he went into surgery for a skin graft, and seeing my dad like that was really hard on both me and my mom. He was full of strong painkillers, so despite his injuries, he seemed to be feeling quite perky, and the irony wasn't lost on us that it was him telling us to stop worrying and that everything would be fine instead of us providing him with any comfort. His skin graft operation went really well, and from where the burn was on his face, you can't really tell he's even scarred unless you look really carefully in the right light. But that was only one part of the puzzle solved. The other part was why the effing hell he'd been targeted in the first place. It kills me to even have to type it out, but the police never caught who threw acid at my dad. But I think that it might have something to do with another acid attack that had happened just the previous year. Don't sue me if I get this bit wrong, because it's all from memory, but it 100% happened and there's news articles about it out there, and if you're interested, you can read more about it. But to my memory, this is what happened. Some guy drove up from London to square up against a local guy, I think from a beef that started on social media, I guess. The Londoner then tracked the local lad down to a park and was carrying a bottle of acid when he confronted him. Now, this is the part that really sends me. The local lad, suspecting that there was acid in the bottle, basically karate kicked the bottle out of his hand as soon as he unscrewed the cap. But then the acid went flying into a woman sitting on a bench nearby, and when she realized what was happening, she was rushed to the hospital. My dad was okay. He got his skin grafted, spent about a week in hospital recovering, and then got sent home. This poor woman, on the other hand, ended up getting a skin infection which then killed her. That could have been my dad. It could have very easily have been my dad under the exact same circumstances. I don't know how the poor woman ended up with a skin infection, but she did. It seems like just the luck of the draw almost. She lost her life because some absolute scrote decided to use acid as a weapon one day. She was rushed to hospital, operated on, all the same stuff as my father, but she lost her life and he didn't. And just writing that out makes me feel so lucky that I could cry. The woman who died was a mother of 3. Her kids must have been absolutely beyond heartbroken, plus horrified that it was bloody acid and a subsequent infection that had killed their mom. Why didn't that happen to me? Why them and not us? I'm not saying I think my dad should have died or anything. No one should have to go before their time like that, especially not in such a horrible way. But the thing that really plays on my mind these days is just that, why them and not us? Another reason I was inspired to write this is the fact that another acid attack happened in London just the other day. I heard it was 2 schoolgirls that got it thrown on them, most likely by a boy that had been rejected after asking one of them out. I support calls for tougher sentences for acid attackers, but it also makes me think, like, how many more times is this going to happen? And in my darker moments, I don't think it'll ever stop. I have this sick feeling that acid attacks are just part of our life now. That if you piss someone off big enough, they won't just beat you up or want to fight or anything else like that. They'll just buy some acid off the internet and throw it in your face. Because with something like that, if you live the rest of your life with horrible scarring, you're considered one of the lucky ones. Because the unlucky ones, like that poor woman sitting on the bench that day, don't get to walk away with their lives intact. So rest in peace to her and to my dad. I love you, and I'm glad you're still here. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my email at LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Fernsey started trying to pull my pants down. What?